Back in the days of the classic Assassin's Creed games, particularly during the Ezio trilogy, a common playground discussion amongst my schoolmates were, what other places and time periods could we have an Assassin's Creed game set in? I remember our minds ran wild with ideas. We had some thoughts on a European setting during the Black Death. We had even pondered the thought of a futuristic sci-fi setting, and that one was always a very divisive discussion. However, one thing we all universally agreed upon was that Ubisoft should totally do a game in Japan. I don't remember exactly why we thought this. Maybe it was just the idea that samurais were cool and Japan is a fun location. So yeah, obviously an Assassin's Creed game there would be awesome. Fast forward a decade and a half, Ubisoft have finally taken the plunge and head to 16th century Japan. And while I found myself enjoying certain aspects of Assassin's Creed Shadows, there were still key elements that prevented this game from being something I would completely and wholeheartedly recommend. Typical Ubisoft tropes that we have seen over and over again are ever present. A long, drawn-out story with awkward pacing for the sake of extended gameplay, and comparisons to a game that came out 5 years ago are all major talking points I want to discuss. But first, I want to talk about our two protagonists, Shinobi Fujibayashi Naoe and Samurai Yasuke. These two characters are not just different genders like in Odyssey and Valhalla, they are actually two different characters with not just their own stories but different gameplay styles. There is a really brief intro scene with Yasuke, but the first several hours of gameplay limit you to playing as Naoe. As Naoe and her father flee from Oda Nobunaga's attack, a mysterious group called the Shinbakufu murder Naoe's father and take a mysterious box which, while Naoe doesn't know the contents of, her father stressed that it was of great importance, and Naoe swears to retrieve it and eliminate the members of the Shinbakufu. The two motivations driving Naoe's actions is the quest to retrieve the box and taking revenge on those who killed her father, and honestly, I didn't feel either were incredibly original. And for most players, I think the motivation is going to be ticking off the boxes as you cross names off the key targets you eliminate on the board. The story later introduces Yasuke, who is given an opportunity to escape slavery from the Portuguese and serve Nobunaga, but intersects his story with Naoe's after the Honoji incident, and from here you can choose to play as either Yasuke or Naoe. There are some specific quests or activities that require you to play as a specific character, but for the most part you can continue in your quest to hunt down the Shinbakufu as either Yasuke or Naoe. There are even some key moments where playing as Naoe or Yasuke will cause you to have slightly different objectives in key moments. Naoe's playstyle tends to be more in line with what you would expect from an Assassin's Creed game, with parkour and a grappling hook, while Yasuke is a heavier hitter with slower mobility but more health. I did not enjoy playing as Yasuke, and aside from essential quests or activities where I required him, I opted to play as Naoe at every opportunity, because the environment 9 times out of 10 did not suit Yasuke. Firstly, just open world exploring is awful, not just with the slower mobility, but not being able to run, jump, and grapple in an Assassin's Creed game was actually quite frustrating. Yes, of course, the benefit of Yasuke is that if you were to take a fortress, you could do it head on, but I found the typical stealth assassin gameplay of taking down an enemy and then scampering away in the night was better than the samurai combat we got. You can swap between the two characters as long as you aren't in combat or an area where enemies will attack you on sight, and yes, there is a small loading screen as you leave the menu to change characters, so it can be a bit clunky if you're going to play as Yasuke to then just constantly swap out every time you need to reach a certain objective like a page in a temple or observe from a high-rise building where you're going to require Naoe. So, as you can see from the gameplay you are watching, I played as Naoe pretty much at every possible turn, because I wanted that fluidity in the gameplay, and for the most part, I actually had a lot more fun playing as Nawe. I think the Japanese setting offers a fantastic playground with some very modest stealth improvements, a variety of weapons, and a reasonable skill tree. You can carve out your own playstyle in Assassin's Creed Shadows. I dumped 50 hours into playing Assassin's Creed Shadows because I wanted to see how the game evolved and give it the fairest possible review, because sometimes Ubisoft games have this issue where you kind of play the first 2 hours and you've kind of played the whole game. Yes, I did have fun with Shadows, and I do think that this is one of the better Assassin's Creed games released in recent times, but there are two core key issues. Firstly, Assassin's Creed Shadows still falls under the umbrella from what we expect for a typical Ubisoft game. If you have played any Ubisoft game in the last 10 years, chances are you have played this game before, but just not with the Japanese coat of paint. Now, I will admit, I really like the look of this coat of paint that we got, but there were still some Ubisoft hurdles blocking my way. I really enjoyed the main quest hunting down the Shinbaku, but eventually you run into that classic trope of enemies being slightly too high level to the point where they are virtually unkillable, but it's that artificial kind of leveling because you level up once and then all of a sudden they are just really easy to fight again. The reason why I hate this trope in video games, particularly when Ubisoft does it, is because a lot of those other side quests you do to get the levels you need are just not as engaging. I just find from a story point of view as well, it causes the pacing to feel offbeat and jarring. You're going down the rabbit hole, you're really close to the answers you're looking for, but then you're just slightly too low of a level to do a particular quest, so you have to run off and do something far less engaging to play catch up. This kind of gameplay is what holds Ubisoft back compared to those other titles such as God of War or Ghost of Tsushima, because in those games, the side quests, exploration, and world are strong enough to where you still get a great mystery, story, or unique gameplay experience when you deviate from the main path. That's sometimes here in Shadows, and there are some really basic contract style quests where if you need extra money or XP, you can do these really basic missions to get that, but it kind of screamed to me a bit like an identity crisis. Because if Ubisoft want to make a grind with RNG items and rarities and force you to play that grind so you sink 50 plus hours like I did, then fine. But it means that the stories you tell are going to be far less meaningful, and of those 50 hours, there is going to be a significant chunk where I'll just listen to a podcast and the game almost becomes just a secondary thing that I'm doing in the background. Shadows does have a store, by the way, where you can buy currency and time savers and even a battle pass for some reason, but thankfully the game is not so artificially halted to the point where you feel you need to open the store menu to progress the game. But I personally would rather 25 to 30 hours of a really good narrative than 50 hours of just an average game, and I just get the feeling that someone at Ubisoft said, the more you play, the more likely you are to buy something. And look, I don't have that data on hand, that might be true, but just going for runtime doesn't make your game memorable or impactful. Even in the skill trees, you see this padding and drawn out experience. While Nawe and Yasuke both level up equally and earn skill points, you need to gain knowledge points to unlock the tiers within the skill trees before you can spend those skill points. I don't hate this idea, but I think it is executed in a very mediocre way. Some require you to find pages in a temple, others involve traversing hidden paths, but there are some really mundane QuickTime events and rhythm games which at times can just feel like a chore, especially if you put off doing them as you go and then you get stuck and need some extra knowledge points, so you go to churn out all these activities to get those skills you need. I do think that this doesn't suffer as much in bloating in terms of the quests and repetitiveness that we got in Valhalla, but truthfully, I think it is a really good Ubisoft game, and that sort of falls a bit short compared to other experiences from other developers. By the way, This game does have a hideout where you can build a base and customize it with different themes and layouts. The idea is that you get new upgrades to help during gameplay, such as improving allies or making more efficient scouts that can help you find objectives, but honestly, I spent very little time in the hideout. The only time I went there was when I wanted to improve my gear or place a building down for a very specific upgrade. Other than that, I didn't spend much time or resources investing into the hideout. Which brings me to the second problem. I mentioned earlier Ghost of Tsushima, and there were so many moments where I sat back in my chair and looked at the games on my shelf and went, I think I'd rather play Ghost of Tsushima than this, especially with a sequel coming out later this year. I just said earlier that Assassin's Creed Shadows is a really good Ubisoft game, but when you compare it to another game with samurais in feudal Japan and open world exploration, the cracks in the armor are exemplified. The environment is diverse and breathtaking in Ghost of Tsushima. It is in Assassin's Creed Shadows, but not as often. The cutscenes and characters in Ghost feel weightier and more impactful. Even the UI makes a big difference. If you wanted to get from point A to point B in Ghost of Tsushima, you could literally let the wind guide you, which was a very eloquent way of minimizing the HUD and letting the world direct where you should adventure instead of just a waypoint. It directly takes advantage of the beauty that was meticulously handcrafted, and because that UI was far less intrusive, you could appreciate and immerse yourself with the beautiful landscape. Assassin's Creed Shadows doesn't do that. In fact, it does the opposite. I'm often searching for UI markers with a dreary investigation tool and finding waypoints and highlighted enemies through walls. It's not a bad thing, but it's nowhere near as impactful as Ghost of Tsushima. Even the Kuji-Kiri rhythm games in Shadows, which is one of the activities you can do for knowledge points, it feels lacking compared to the haikus in Ghost of Tsushima, because the haikus, although they weren't amazing, they gave you an opportunity to connect with the world and the environment. Again, letting the world do the talking. Shadows says that the Kuji-Kiri activity is a chance for you to meditate and take in the environment as well, but focusing on a rhythm game feels forced, whereas those ghost haikus, again, let the world do the talking. You get to see the environment and be part of it, have that connection. The moment-to-moment combat in Ghost of Tsushima was far stronger, with more interesting combos and unique stances, further making me feel less inclined to play as Yasuke, who is just a watered-down version of Jin's Sakai. Sure, there are some good parries and combos you can do in Assassin's Creed Shadows, but it's nothing new and fresh, whereas those stances in Ghost of Tsushima was just another level of depth, which I really appreciated. The gameplay in Ghost of Tsushima also complemented the story, because as you transformed into the ghost using these dishonorable tactics that go against the Bushido style of war, it challenged relationships with other characters. Whereas in Shadows, even playing as Nawe, we get shinobi ninja seeking revenge, and it just doesn't have that same impact. You might think I'm being very harsh on Shadows, and look, to some extent you might be right. Ghost of Tsushima is a masterpiece and was the last hurrah for the PlayStation 4 back in 2020. But this is 5 years later, and Ubisoft is under serious pressure. The success or failure of Shadows could very well dictate the future of the company, and I think if the result is one of the best games we've produced for a while, but still not as good as something that came out 5 years ago from another developer on a previous generation, then at best, I think it just buys Ubisoft time instead of directly addressing the key issues they have with their approach to game design. I can understand to a degree why Ubisoft made some of the decisions to pad out the gameplay the way they did in Assassin's Creed Shadows. And I'm aware that the company has been trying this whole live service thing, which has just not been working, and now they're at this really critical stage in their life. But I think the best single player games are not ones that keep players engaged for hours and hours on end by just checking off a near endless list of boxes. The best single player games involve a clearly told narrative that allows players to feel and connect with characters, gameplay that is fun and engaging whilst offering variety to combat different challenges, a world where players want to explore and uncover the secrets that lie off the path to the main objective. Assassin's Creed Shadows does have some of this and is by no means a bad game, but it just falls short in creating something truly special. Yes, there were plenty of fun moments in Assassin's Creed Shadows. I did like hunting down the Shinbak Fu and making some difficult decisions as Nawe and Yasuke. There were definitely times where the game visually impressed me, and I don't care how many times I've done it, jumping off buildings into suspiciously placed haystacks is still fun. But the truth is that Ubisoft have created a game which we have seen many times before. And I think the big pull factor for Shadows is the theme itself. There is something about Japanese culture and the feudal era of samurais and clans which I find really interesting, and the country itself is a vast landscape with rich color palettes and moving sunsets. But I wonder if this game had not been set in an era and location which I love exploring, I don't know if I would have been so sympathetic. Can I recommend Assassin's Creed Shadows? Fine, sure. It is, after all, one of the best Assassin's Creed games which we have had in a long time. But if you are someone who is exhausted of the same tried and tested Ubisoft formula, and you aren't as passionate as I am about the Japanese setting, then there is a real chance you might feel fatigued and catch yourself looking up rumors online for when Ghost of Yotai releases. That's all for my review on Assassin's Creed Shadows. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like and consider subscribing so you don't miss my upcoming videos. Also, I wanted to give a very big shout out to Hated Names, who wrote and performed the backing music for this video. Please feel free to check out some of his work via the link in the description below. As always, thank you so much for watching. Lancey out.